and appreciate you all being here. And for those of you that are streaming, thank you for being there. And we have a gentleman here, Ryan Call, who is from EcoCycle, and he has a master's in, tell me again, environmental policy. And he's been with EcoCycle 2 years, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say, so I'll turn it over to you. We are going to do a free will offering and have a basket at the back, so if anybody wants to drop something in there, that would be appreciated by their nonprofit. Thanks.
Well, hi everyone. Can you hear me all right? Get the levels all right? Well, great. It's good to see you all. This is a big crowd for me. All right. You know, it's easier to stay home, but if you would have stayed home tonight, you would have missed the excellent soup. Thank you for whoever made that. And Pam, thank you for the introduction here. So if you could hit the next slide here, I'll get launched into this topic, zero waste, which I studied, which is my full-time job, and it's a topic that I am endlessly fascinated in and passionate about. So next slide, please. So this is a good starting point, I think. For a lot of folks, an introduction into environmental issues of all types might start with reduce, reuse, recycle. I think everyone here has probably heard that. That was my introduction into environmental issues as a kid. But zero waste is so much. Did I drop something? All right, everyone's welcome here. So zero waste is more than just reduce, reuse, recycle. What else? You know, we've heard of those 3 R's, but what are some other R's? Just shout them out if you have any ideas. Substitute, yes. Refuse, excellent. Now we're thinking a couple more here. What else? That's all right. If you hit the next slide, I'll bombard you with more R's here. All right, so rot through composting is also part of zero waste. Repairing things, so you don't have to throw something broken away and just replace it. You know, it's true when we say that things aren't made like they used to be. Repairing things is very much a zero waste concept. One of my favorite R's is the redesign or rethink for things to be more sustainable, to be more recyclable. You mentioned refuse, right? I don't know about you, but I live and breathe zero waste, but I still have a drawer in my kitchen that has soy sauce packets and chopsticks, so I try to refuse more to have fewer things that I don't need in my life. There's also repurposing things and regifting things. Isn't it great when you have something that can have a second life and a higher purpose than just being thrown out? I love regifting books and music. I think there's a stigma around, well, I got a gift, you know, this is a gift, but people who know me know that I love to gift books and CDs and records. But I think the most important R of all zero waste, the thing that ties all of this together, is relationships. These concepts, reduce, reuse, recycle, the other R's, they wouldn't have much of an impact if we didn't build relationships with all these different things and share information and expertise. So you'll hear me go back to that concept of relationships being part of zero waste all throughout tonight. Next slide, please. So I like to start these presentations kind of high level, kind of conceptual, because I think that helps when we get into the details of things such as hard to recycle materials or composting. We have this broader idea and framework of what zero waste is. So I was told that it's good to just have a solid definition to start with. And this definition was developed by the Zero Waste International Alliance. So people who work in this space from all around the world came together and hashed out a definition of zero waste. And if you can't see it here, I'll just read it. It says that zero waste is the conservation of all resources by means of responsible production, consumption, reuse, and recovery of products, packaging, and materials without burning and with no discharges or pollution to the land, water, or air that threaten the environment or human health. It's kind of a long definition of zero waste, but this definition very much encompasses more than just reduce, reuse, recycle. Next slide, please. So here are some of the topics that I'm going to cover today, and I should mention too that I'm a big believer in answering questions. So I know that I'm the first to admit that recycling in particular is confusing. So if you have a question that you would like answered and you feel it's an appropriate time, please just raise your hand and I'll get that addressed. Some things I'll answer later in the presentation, so I'll just let you know about that. And if there's a bigger thing you want to ask, or if you're not comfortable speaking in front of the group, I'll hang out afterwards too, so we can get those questions answered. Because when I was going through school, the best way that I learned was from having a question and getting that answered. I think that is really powerful, and I'd like to pass that along to you. So some of the topics I'm going to cover are talking about zero waste as a climate solution. I'll talk about the economics of zero waste and circularity, which I think is a fascinating and sort of under-talked about concept. I'll spend a good amount of time talking about composting, hard-to-recycle materials, right? The things that are outside of our recycle bins but can still have a second life. I'll talk about a groundbreaking recycling policy that was passed last year for a bit. And I like to wrap up by doing some myth busting, breaking some misconceptions, and then finally talk about how you can incorporate zero waste in your life if you choose to. Next slide, please. So it's good to also mention, who is EcoCycle? How many here have heard of EcoCycle before? You? Excellent. I had a crowd the other day, and everyone already knew who EcoCycle was, and I was like, okay, well. But I'm not shy to say that I love my job. I found my EcoCycle while working on my master's, and I have not looked back since. It has only helped me develop as a person and professional. So EcoCycle is a zero-waste nonprofit that is Boulder-based. I'm their one Denver guy. I got the whole city to myself. And it was started in 1976 as a volunteer project. The first Earth Day was in 1970, and that really kicked off what we consider the modern environmental movement. And in Boulder, this scrappy volunteer organization, EcoCycle, became the first organization to bring curbside recycling to Colorado. And we did that by buying an old school bus and yanking off the back door so you could throw in newspapers and bottles and cans back when it was that simple to recycle those things. So since then, we've grown into a company with, I hear feedback. Should I face this way? All right. We've grown into a company of about 60 people in our different departments, and we manage about an $8 million budget annually. One of the biggest things that we do in Boulder is that we don't own, but we manage the Boulder County Recycling Center. So that's the big recycling center where curbside recycling gets dumped from the trucks and gets sorted by workers and machines and robots. So that facility is owned by the people of Boulder County. That's a publicly owned facility, and for the last 20 years, we've been operating it in terms of hiring and management practices and making decisions on how to recycle in an environmentally and socially responsible way. Right next door from the Boulder County Recycling Center, we own and operate EcoCycle's Center for Hard-to-Recycle Materials. And that is a drop-off recycling center where we accept all sorts of weird things, such as books and bicycles and toilets and fire extinguishers and Christmas lights. And there's a list of 26 things, and it's been on my to-do list to memorize all those and hash them out at once, but I'll spare you from trying to do that. I'm very proud of our schools department. We have a staff of about a dozen people who go to K through 12 schools in the Boulder School District and the St. Vrain Valley School District. And we teach age-appropriate lessons to kids of all ages. And what we found is that, since the late 80s, and we've refined our different lessons, is that kids understand recycling and composting. And in a lot of cases, they take what they learned at school and come home and teach their parents how to recycle properly. So we're continuing to do that, and as I mentioned up top, recycling was my introduction into environmental issues. But we do more here, and I've got a slide to show this. We also do commercial hauling. Sorry, I'm going to pause right here. Is my audio all right? I feel my mic. It's fine? All right. So we also operate trucks in Boulder County, and we collect recycling and composting, but we don't collect trash. That's not our business. There are other businesses that want to do that. But as I'll show you on the next slide, we just bought the nation's first fully electric compost collection vehicle. So it's zero waste and zero emissions. And then on that last slide there, I just wanted to mention too that the department that I work in is the Small But Mighty Policy and Outreach Department, where I have the pleasure of doing things like presentations like this, and also bothering lawmakers. I should say informing them, but I also bother them a little bit. So here's some photos to help ground the things I spoke about. I wonder if I put it on the wrong ear.
It's getting closer, yeah, and if you still can pull it over a little bit.
All right, so I mentioned the Boulder County Recycling Center. That is the bottom image there, and the way it was designed is unique in that when the citizens of Boulder County voted to create a recycling center, one of the stipulations was to build it in an environmentally responsible manner. So there's a lot of natural light, and a lot of the building materials are made from recycled materials. And we also have a lot of educational displays, and the facility is designed to come and bring in a big tour group and see recycling in action. I believe that the antidote to skepticism around recycling is to see it for yourself. And unfortunately, a lot of recycling facilities are not designed to easily bring in people and educate them. In the middle photo here, we have some kids of our Green Star Schools program that tend to divert about 2/3 of the whole school's waste. So when we teach kids on how to recycle and compost, we found really high numbers, higher than most communities throughout Colorado. In the upper left-hand corner, there's at least a corner of our Center for Hard to Recycle Materials, where we always have a stack of about 20 mattresses, and I'll talk about a cool program that we partner with concerning mattress recycling a little bit later. And in the upper right-hand corner is our fully electric compost collection vehicle. And when we bought this vehicle, we have folks who've worked for EcoCycle for decades, and one gentleman has been driving trucks for about 30 years, so it was pretty cool for him to test drive this. And after he gave it a spin and came back, he said, "Well, what'd you think of it?" And he said, "It was like driving a 25-ton golf cart." And I just love that image, right? Normal, whether it's recycling or trash collection vehicles, get about 3 miles to the gallon, and they tend to be diesel. So we wanted to be forward-thinking in how we collect recycling and compost, and recent news is that one of the big trash haulers just bought a whole bunch of electric trucks, so we're hoping to see more green vehicles collecting our, not just waste, but our resources too. Next slide, please. All right, so let's get into some numbers here and frame where we're at in Colorado. So EPA takes all the numbers of recycling around the country and crunches it down and says, okay, on average, America diverts, meaning recycling and composting, about 32% of our waste. Does anyone want to take a guess about where we're at in Colorado? Green Colorado with our amazing national parks. I wish it was 32, but if you hit the next slide here, 15%, less than half of Colorado's waste is diverted to be recycled or composted. And to me, that's not discouraging. It really isn't. What I see there is that there's a huge opportunity to grow, and when we grow that number, this is not just an abstract number, it directly relates to fewer greenhouse gas emissions and more green jobs supported. So we've got room to grow, and I'm happy to be along for the ride. Next slide, please. So it's good to even ask, why focus on waste at all? Why do I have a job talking about this? And, why is there an interest in coming out and listening to me speak anyway? And you'll hear me say this throughout my presentation, and that is that by being zero waste, right, not just recycling, we are making the most of Earth's finite resources. I've been meaning to take out this number. About 42% of greenhouse gas emissions come from our stuff. That's an EPA number, and it's a bit of a rabbit hole, so ignore that for now. But another reason to focus on waste is the tremendous environmental damage it can have. For instance, landfills are the third largest emitter of methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas in the country. So it's oil and gas emits the most methane, then livestock, mostly from cows, and then we're focusing on waste because we can do something about the methane that's generated in our landfills. And finally, one thing that I think drew me, I think a number of things drew me to this issue, but I'm fascinated by things that we think are out of sight and out of mind, because when we throw things away is not really a place, right? It's going to a landfill, or hopefully a recycling facility or a composting facility. Has anyone here toured the Denver Arapahoe disposal site, our regional landfill? No one? You've been there? Yeah. If there's a chance to do a tour of that, you won't forget it. It's, we have a beautiful mountain range to the west, but to the east we have a mountain of trash. It's the third largest landfill in the country. And I'll remember being a bus just driving up to the top where they tip materials, thinking like, this is kind of like Mount Evans. No, it's not that big in a sense, but it's a sight you'll never forget, because when we all throw things away and it's out of sight and out of mind, that's where it ends up, and there's a lot of it, and it just continues to grow, but we can do something about it. Next slide, please. So I love this image here, and I've got an image later here that kind of frames the difference between how we have been doing things and how we can be doing things. So when we talk about the linear economy, what it really means is it goes in a line, right? We take resources by mining, logging, fracking, whatever it might be. We make those resources into materials, and there's, I lost a bit of my train of thought there, but we make materials, and then when we use them up, I just mentioned the landfill, then we dispose of that resource. It's not necessarily waste, but a resource, and then that's it. A landfill is essentially a graveyard of resources. So we compare that linear economy to what we talk about when we say the circular economy, where we can keep this circle spinning the more that we recycle those resources that we've already have taken and made and remanufacture it. And that can support jobs locally, and again, has a much lower environmental impact compared to the linear economy. Next slide, please. So this is an image from the Zero Waste International Alliance called the Zero Waste Hierarchy, and it's a way of thinking about our waste and our resources, right? So I mentioned rethinking and redesigning things. That's at the top of the list, because if we're not rethinking how we do things or redesigning our materials to be more durable or recyclable or sustainable, then we just perpetuate the problems that we've already created. So that's at the top. And something that gets lost when we teach reduce, reuse, recycle is that that's in order, right? It's in an order of environmental preferability, where it's best to reduce the amount of unnecessary waste in the first place, reuse what we can, and then finally recycle. And I think somewhere along the line, recycling made a shortcut, and there are valid criticisms of that, right? We should be reducing and reusing more than just recycling and composting. And then there are less preferable environmental options, such as when they say materials recovery or residuals management, that can refer to burning waste for energy, which I'm not a fan of and I can get into, or landfilling materials. So that's at the bottom of the list. And you can take like a disposable bag, for example. That's something that kind of made a full circle because disposable bags weren't always a thing. But when we rethought it and said, well, a reusable bag is more durable, the more you use it, it cancels all the single-use bags that you could be making and using in the first place. Then there's no need to recycle it or to landfill it or burn it. You just keep reusing it and therefore reducing the demand for single-use plastic bags. So that's an example I like to bring up, but you can apply this sort of thinking to all sorts of different materials. Just took a sip of my reusable mug, which keeps my drink cold all day. But this zero waste hierarchy framework can be applied to all sorts of materials. Next slide, please. So I'll start by talking about the environment, and the three ways that zero waste helps the environment is by saving energy in the remanufacturing process. It reduces emissions from landfills, which I mentioned earlier, and then when we talk about compost, I'll talk about how composting helps restore soils and pull carbon out of the atmosphere, just like trees. Next slide, please. So I think another thing that gets lost when we talk about recycling in particular is why recycle. And this graph shows that depending on the material, every time that you recycle it, that saves energy and therefore greenhouse gas emissions compared to mining and logging and fracking resources. So let's take aluminum as an example, because that saves the most amount of energy every time you recycle it. So let's think about aluminum. Where does that come from, and how does it work, right? So aluminum is mined in a lot of times South America or Australia as a bauxite ore, and I'm sure we've all seen images of strip mines and the environmental damage that happens there. That ore is often shipped to Iceland, where that bauxite ore is refined into aluminum, what we would recognize as raw aluminum. Then that aluminum is shipped all around the world, but let's use Colorado as an example, where we love our craft beers, right? So the aluminum gets rolled out into a can that is filled up with your favorite local craft beer, and you drink it, and then you have a choice, right? You can recycle that can that will be processed locally and melt it down and turn it into a new can and save over 90% of the energy, or you could put it in a landfill where it's a graveyard of our resources, and that's it for that aluminum. And you need to continue that mining and shipping and refining process all over again. And even setting the environmental aspect of that to the side for a second, let's think about supply and demand. If we are recycling more aluminum locally, then we have a greater supply of aluminum. And that helps our economy, right? All of our great big and small brewers here in Colorado. They want more aluminum so that they don't have to pay a higher price because there's less of it available. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the economics. This blew my mind when I learned more about recycling outside of the environmental benefits of it. One company, Resource Recycling Systems, did a study for the state on the environmental impact of what we landfill just 2-3 years ago, and what they found was that the amount of material that we're landfilling, if we were to recycle it, then we could be saving up to $100 million in recyclable materials. Some materials are more valuable than others, but they crunched the numbers and found that if we recycled and composted as much as we can feasibly, then we could be saving $100 million every year. And what I think about that is every year, what could the $100 million be reinvested into Colorado? Could be doing all sorts of good by maintaining the economic value of our recyclables. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk about jobs and the people side of recycling too. And one report said that recycling and reuse can create and support up to 9 times as many jobs compared to landfilling, right? When you landfill, you take a material and you dump it and then bury it, and then that's it for it, right? A graveyard of resources, compared to when you recycle, that's going to a facility that's managed, that has actual people working there. There are also people who manage those systems, people who design and engineer the robots and machines that are used to sort those recyclables. And then the more that those materials are recycled, it props up those jobs. So that was a fascinating report to read. Some numbers from the EPA, and this is, it says it's from 2020, but they're pulling numbers from 2012. So the recycling rate's somewhat plateaued, but again, we have a long way to go, so I believe that these numbers will only keep going up. And it's also good to point out that I am one of the 681,000 recycling jobs, and my coworkers are among those jobs just here in the US. Now, those jobs contribute to $37.8 billion worth of wages. I don't make that much, but that's the whole sector, their estimate. And of those wages, that contributes to $5.5 billion of tax revenue. Again, if we can improve our recycling and reuse systems, then these numbers can just grow locally here in the US and in Colorado. And simply put, to zoom out on the economics of recycling, the more valuable materials that are captured, whether it's through your curbside bin or through another recycling program, the more local jobs can be supported. Next slide, please. And here's an example of what we would call the local circular economy using a material we all know well, and that's glass. So when you recycle a glass bottle or jar in your curbside recycling bin, that goes to a recycling sorting facility in North Denver. And the actual recycling doesn't happen there. It's more of just sorting out your papers and plastics and aluminum and also glass. So all that glass gets crushed, and it's a big mess of glass and also paper, right? The label's there. And then that recycling sorting facility sends that off to a company formerly called Momentum, now called Glass to Glass, that is based in Broomfield. And what they do there is they take in that dirty sorted glass and they wash it and break it down even more and sort it based on color. And voila, that is a manufacturing feedstock that can be sold to, whether it's Rocky Mountain Bottling Company or Owens, Illinois Bottling Company here in Colorado, where they can melt down that glass that's a raw resource now, and that company can send it again to your favorite local brewers, and that can be filled up, sold to you, recycled, and sorted all over again. That whole process only takes about a month up to 6 weeks, and that same material, that very same glass that you chose to recycle instead of landfill, can infinitely be recycled right here in the Front Range, right? Not even the whole state, but within a 50-mile radius. I think that's pretty cool, and in my work, I'd like to support more of these local circular economies. If not in Colorado, then in the US, right? It wouldn't make sense to be recycling paper that's a very water-intensive process here in Colorado where we don't have much water. In that case, we'd like to recycle more paper in the Pacific Northwest. And you can take plastics, for example. A lot of plastics manufacturing happens in the Gulf or in other industrial centers, such as like Ohio, Pennsylvania. We should be recycling plastics here. So we want to prop up those systems. Next slide, please. Yes?
So how do they deal with the different colors of glass?
They have a system that sorts based on light. So they bring in all these broken up pieces of glass, and I don't know the robots of it, but they use light somehow to sort the clear and green and sometimes blue and mostly brown glass. And I have not toured their facility yet, but I really hope to understand those processes better. But Glass to Glass, yeah, formerly Momentum Recycling. Some folks only know it as Momentum. Thank you. And I want to talk about some more jobs, and then maybe I'll pause there to see if there are any more questions. Normally, people are have a ton of questions at this point, but let me share this example, and I'll open things up for questions before I move on. And that is outside of our recycling bin. So at EcoCycle, we partner with two excellent organizations, one of them being a mattress recycler in Commerce City called Springback. And this Springback is a play on words, one in the sense that they recycle mattresses, but also springing back in the sense that they hire people who are coming out of incarceration or recovering from addiction or have some other barrier to employment. Springback says, yeah, we'll hire you. In fact, we want to hire you. And there's money to be made in pulling out these springs to be recycled as scrap metal, or pulling out the fluff of mattresses to be used as insulation, or the scrap wood that can be, in some cases, composted. So again, if you ever tour a landfill, there are a ton of mattresses. Now, I don't understand that. I'm happy with my mattress, but there are a lot of mattresses at a landfill taking up a lot of space. And this is a stark example of, we could be burying that mattress, which, it's not cheap to landfill either. Or you could be giving someone a job who needs a job, that work. And that's, again, right in the Denver metro area. Another company that we're really proud of working with is Blue Star Recyclers. And this is a similar concept, and Blue Star hires folks who are on the autism or neurodivergent spectrum, and what they do is they recycle electronics. So they bring in all sorts of old laptops and computers and televisions, which I should mention too, electronic waste is the fastest growing waste stream. I mentioned at the top of my presentation that things aren't made quite like they used to be anymore. And in a lot of cases, electronics are made to break over time so that companies can sell you a new electronic, which I just want to pull my hair out on it. But you're laughing, I feel that too. But that's a great example, In a lot of cases, the electronics that we have rare earth, heavy metals in them that, again, we could be burying, or we could be giving people who might have a barrier to employment in other cases a job recycling those electronics and recirculating those heavy metals locally. I saw a question.
Just wondering, recycling, we have computers and batteries and all that to be recycled, and bulbs, light bulbs. But I can't put it in my regular recycling bin,
Right.
Because it has to be, how do we get, do they come around? Do they pick it up? Do we have a drop-off place?
So Blue Star does have a drop-off place in central Denver, and sometimes they partner with different local municipalities, and they'll do like a springtime drop-off drive, and you can bring your recyclables, and sometimes it costs money oftentimes it costs money to, pay the worker for the labor to recycle those materials. But you're right, you highlight that these hard-to-recycle centers are not everywhere, and they need to be propped up, or at least have some sort of system to be able to collect those materials. And you also mentioned that, you shouldn't put a laptop computer in your curbside recycling bin, and, it's good to ask, why is that? And I'll tell you, the number one cause of fires, not just at recycling centers, but also at landfills, are from batteries, right? Because, all these material gets piled on these batteries, and in a lot of cases, that's paper and other combustibles. Plastic also catches on fire quite quickly. If that battery gets conducted somehow and a spark happens, that is the number one cause of fires at recycling centers. And I should mention, when I toured the Denver Arapahoe disposal site landfill, we were driving up the mountain of trash, and I saw a truck that was on fire. And I was like, are you going to say something about the truck that's on fire? And they said, that's probably a electronics fire. They happen quite often because these electronics are built to break. And when it's piled high on trash, they've just got to douse it and hope that it went out and see if it's still burning, and then douse it again.
There's a recycling of the chemicals, like oil and the other chemicals that we need to get rid of, and even medication. We can't just put it in the water system because it'll pollute the water system.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point, that we need ways to capture all sorts of chemicals. And one widely used chemical is paint. And, we all know not to flush that either down our toilets or drains. But in Colorado, we have a special system where the cost of recycling paint is paid for up front. With every time you buy a gallon of paint, there is maybe 10 cents or so attached to that paint, and that pays for easy recycling for that paint. So we have a great program called Green Sheen that, for free in a sense that it's already been paid for through your gallons of paint, you can call them up and say, hey, I've got a church program and we want to do a paint drive. And they'll say, great, when and where? And they'll show up with a box truck and you just bring in your paint and there's no handling fee or anything. They'll take it back to their facility, reprocess it, and a lot of times either sell it if they can or donate it to communities that need it. So that paint care is a great example of one of those other recycling systems outside of our curbside bin.
I'm sorry, but do you have a list of people that we could, and telephone numbers that we could call for any certain type of recycling so that we could find out where and how? Because I've got stuff I want to get rid of, but I'm not going to put it into trash.
Yeah, I do have resources, and that's a good time for me to pass around my clipboard. And let's see, I saw a pen right around here, or a pencil. If you want to put on, oh, that is a broken pen. Do you have one? If you want to be on my mailing list, I'll send you updates on all sorts of zero waste happenings. But if you have a specific thing that you want, make a note of it on my clipboard, and I'll send you some resources. And I'll send Pam a list too, but I'll keep that in mind that I have all sorts of resources that I love sharing with people and making those solutions. Because I know that we are helping the environment and the local economy when we recycle these materials.
Question.
Yes?
It seems to me it would be better if you would list all of those recycling opportunities and companies that do them and put them on your website so we all can get access to them, rather than doing it one-on-one with a name on a piece of paper.
That's a good point, and that's something that I'll bring up to my employers, because we have that, but it's really they really have the resources for Boulder County. Now, the city and county of Denver has a list, but it's a little out of date. But that brings up a good point, and I'll put that on my to-do list to compile a more appropriate Denver metro area universal recycling list. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Another question, hi.
Yeah, I'll second or third that, because from time to time I'll go on the web and Google something that how do I dispose of a XYZ, whatever it might be, whether
Yeah.
it's chemical or a propane tank or a TV or whatever, and it's not easy.
Right?
It's not it's maybe even it's worse than that. Some of the stuff I can't find it, and I'm not too bad at digging around on a computer, and I can't find what to do with this. So, and that's education. That's got to be really important. It's got to be improved.
That's a great point, and I agree with you. In my work of trying to bring about zero waste solutions, the barriers that I run into consistently are confusion, and I'm the first to admit that recycling is confusing. Cost, right? And wherever we can help those costs out, like that paint example, try to break down those cost barriers. And then also convenience, because I'm not going to recommend to any of you to drive up to Boulder to recycle one thing. Now, if you have a truckload of things from your community that you've been saving up for the year, that might make sense. But recycling needs to be convenient. Agreed. Another question.
And since I have the mic, I have one more. You've used the words verbally and also on your screen, economy. Linear versus circular. People generally don't do things unless there's some sort of it's hard for persons to do things without some sort of an economic benefit, whether it's not necessarily to them, but to the country or to the city or to the community. And you're talking about more jobs, better economy. Is that really true? Is it, if we went into a significantly more of a circular economy, is that going to cost more?
Yeah, it might. Like any sort of project to start off, it does cost money to invest to get that system moving. But in these cases that I've highlighted, they are local jobs here, right? And when we have more recycling, then we are recirculating those resources locally. So in a lot of cases, we're bringing in resources from all over the world, and we need to manufacture things. But instead of disposing of it through these systems, we can keep them churning.
9 times as many jobs. That's salaries. Forget the tax benefits. That's salaries that employers have to pay, and that increases typically cost of doing things or cost of products. I mean, I'm not negative. I want this to succeed. I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, and I'm happy to, if you want to make a note on my clipboard, I'm happy to share that report with you, but it's, there's a lot of room to grow with recycling, absolutely. We got another question before I, thank you for giving me a heads up when this microphone steers away from my ear.
Okay. It's my understanding that Sherwin-Williams will recycle your paint up to 3 gallons at a time, and most paint stores will do that. Also, if you have prescription drugs, I dropped off my unused oxycodone today at the pharmacy. They have a container to drop off any kind of drugs. So things are out there, and they're not that far away.
Thank you for sharing that, and I think that that's a good point, that you should be able to recycle things where you get them. Let's move on. If you want to hit the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about plastics, because plastics, of all the confusing things in recycling, plastics are the most confusing. And I'm worried that if I try to bend this too much, it might break. It's a little rigid. Yeah. How's that? A little better? Okay. Plastics are confusing, and when I first got my job at EcoCycle and they were telling me about plastics, they said, don't worry about those numbers 1 through 7. Let's set that aside for a minute. What they had me say out loud 3 times, no joke, when they were training me on plastics, was they said that the type of plastics that are generally recyclable are plastic bottles, tubs, jugs, and jars. Bottles, tubs, jugs, and jars. And the reason that those tend to be more recyclable is if you tour a recycling center, you'll see that people aren't grabbing every bottle and saying, is that a 1 or a 7? Is that a 2 or a 5? What's happening specifically for plastics is that there are conveyor belts moving recyclables along, and there are robots looking at these, and they're not looking for that number, they're looking for a shape of plastic. And if they can separate a bottle, tub, jug, or jar, they tend to be capturing those higher value and more recyclable types of plastics. So if you want to know the numbers, yeah, I see a question here. Go ahead.
What about those that have paper wrapped around them? I mean, like I get oat milk, comes in a plastic bottle, but it tells you to zip off the outer layer.
Sure, and I can repeat your question there about having paper wrapped in plastic, paper labels on plastics. And in most cases, you can leave labels on. Now, I see that you used an example where there's like a little zipper on the side to say to take off the label. And most companies will just take plastic anyway, and that paper will be removed in the recycling process. So a lot of times you'll see recycling instructions on a product, but what really counts, what makes something recyclable, is if it's recyclable in your area. Because one piece of that confusion with recycling is that these rules change depending on where you live. I'm sure many of you have moved and said, wait a minute, you don't take this, or this was recyclable, and maybe they change over time. And this is a good time to mention the 2 criteria that make something recyclable. And it's, I should mention that this does not necessarily mean that something's recyclable. This is an unregulated symbol that companies put on all sorts of products that are not recyclable. So what makes something recyclable is, one, if it can be sorted at a recycling facility or separated at some sort of drop-off center. So it needs to be sortable. And then two, someone needs to, or at least the economic conditions have to be right, to buy and reprocess and sell that material again. So in the case of plastic bottles, tubs, jugs, and jars, they can be sorted through the machines at our Colorado recycling centers. And those bottles, tubs, jugs, and jars tend to be those higher value plastics compared to other plastics that they can't quite reprocess.
I did have another question. Jean?
What is preferable? I mean, when I go to buy, say, soda, is it best to buy in aluminum cans and thinking that that's the most recyclable product?
Yes, aluminum is an excellent material as long as it's recycled, because if it's landfilled, then there goes all that value. But if you can recycle it, then that over time has a lower environmental impact compared to that plastic. And it's good to ask too, with plastics, where does plastic even come from, right? We know aluminum's a metal and glass is made from sand and other materials, but plastics come from oil and gas. They are derived in the refining process. So the more plastics that we buy, we're telling the free market that we want more plastics, which, having studied plastic problems, is we want fewer plastics, or at least to have smarter systems to keep them from leaking into the environment. All right, next slide, please. We got some more on plastic. You might have seen in the news last year in particular, there was a report saying that only 9% of plastics are recycled. And that caused a lot of people to call us and say, what's going on? And where that number came from was a Greenpeace report, and they made it clear, but I think the media construed this number. People saw that and said, wait, is that 9% of the plastics that I put in my curbside bin? That's not the case. The case is that 9% of the plastics, and again, this is an estimate, 9% of plastics that are made entirely. Now, that includes plastics that are in your car or in clothing that are not designed to be recycled. 9% of all of the plastics are recycled. So that speaks to that relatively low or rate that can be improved, and just the amount of plastic that's in our life. This is really a late 20th and 21st century material, and in a lot of ways, it's a miracle material. You can do so many things with plastic, but in a lot of cases, the packaging that we use, about 40% of all the plastic we make is packaging. In a lot of cases, we can be smarter with that design, or it'd make more sense to use a glass or aluminum or even paper product, or no packaging at all, right? I use the example of a reusable bag, and that's completely reducing plastics in the first place. And based on my studies, that is the answer to the plastic pollution crisis, and that is reducing the amount of plastics, unnecessary plastics, altogether.
Oh, yeah, I have several questions actually. I always heard to take the tops off of all those plastics or glass or whatever. Okay. Does it make sense as things go through the MRF to put the lid, if they're not metal, in with your recycling or not?
Lids. This is a very popular question, and you use the term MRF, and that's MRF, Materials Recovery Facility, or a recycling center. And the question is about lids, and are they recyclable? Do you leave them on or take them off? And let's use a plastic bottle, for example. And this is a great example of a rule that has changed over time. It used to be to throw away the lid. That's not recyclable. But identifying that as an issue and saying, well, wait a minute, bottle producers want that bottle cap back when they recycle plastics. Now the rule is you can leave the plastic lid on your bottles and recycle the whole thing. they're two different types of plastics, but when they are shredded up and reprocessed, since there are different densities of plastics, they can be separated in the process. So as you'll see, I like to give people the long answer whenever they ask. I could just say, yeah, leave it on, next question. But I've found, and maybe this is just how my brain works and I roll with it, is that, it'd be a lot if I just stood up here and said what is recyclable, what is not. And that'd be a lot of information, and it'd be like in grade school where you do the flashcard and memorize in rote. But when I can explain the process, or maybe tell a story, like in the case of Springback, I think that helps stick more. And I see people nodding, so I'm going to keep giving the long answer.
So in the Boulder Recycling Center, that's where your MRF, or the Materials Recovery Facility, is. And can anybody tour that? Because I would really like to come tour that.
Yeah. So the the tour guidelines changed a little bit because of the pandemic. But every Tuesday from 9 in the morning to 3 p.m., because that's kind of when the shifts run, anyone can pull up and walk in the front door and do a self-guided tour. Now, if you see someone in a t-shirt like this, you can ask all sorts of questions, but there are a lot of displays. Again, that recycling center, we're very proud to have designed it to invite the public in. So there are a lot of educational displays and videos and windows, so you can see what's going on from a safe distance, because recycling centers can be loud, smelly, and also dangerous, right? I wouldn't want, I just toured a different recycling center in Denver the other day, and I wouldn't want a group of kids running around there. But at the Boulder County Recycling Center, it's designed to bring in school kids. See another question?
Okay, we talked about plastic, talked about medication, we talked about batteries and all, and that sort of stuff. The biggest thing is the landfill. Where are we going to, we don't have, some of that stuff's being composted in the landfill. That's where the methane comes from. So what can be done for that to reduce that?
Yeah, so the question is on landfill, methane, and composting. And if I'm remembering correctly, that might even be my next slide, if you want to hit the next one. It's not the next slide, but I'll answer your question. If you tour the landfill, you'll see that there's a system of pipes to try to capture that methane. And I should even take a step back and say, where does this methane come from? Why is it a problem that we are landfilling organic materials such as food scraps and yard trimmings? And what happens in a landfill when you dump that material and cover it up and pack it down and seal it off is that it decomposes without oxygen anaerobically. And that causes a chemical reaction with the organic material that generates methane that can leak out of that landfill cover. Now, that methane greenhouse gas is up to 85 times as powerful as CO2. So in some cases, landfills set up piping and they try to capture that methane gas, but the study showed that they can only capture about 30% of that methane. And again, why focus on waste? It's because we can do something about it. And so by keeping organic material out of the landfill, that's one environmental benefit, and I'll talk about the whole other environmental benefit of actively composting in a couple slides here. I'll just mention, people ask what not to recycle in your curbside recycling bin, and every recycling center in the country will tell you that the first, second, and third things to keep out of the recycling system are plastic bags, because they get caught in the sorting machinery, which I've got a photo of here, and in our case, we have to shut everything off and go into this machine and cut out the plastic bags. There's been some sort of technology to try to to pull the plastic bags out of the stream entirely, but they are consistently the #1 contaminant. And then also food and liquid, because we forget, we're not just recycling and it goes away. We recycle it, and it's the act of doing that is helping support someone's job who is standing beside a conveyor belt and pulling out certain materials. So when you have food and liquid, that can attract bugs and pests that we don't want to expose workers to. And I'm going to answer another question, which is probably my second most asked question. It's how clean is clean? We always hear recycle, clean, recycling. And I'll mention that it doesn't have to be sparkling clean like my little image here. It just has to be empty. So, a little shot of water in a tomato jar, if you put on the lid and shake it up, that will not only keep our workers safer and, not exposed to pests, etc., but it will also make that glass more valuable when it's sold, right? The cleaner the material, the higher it can be sold for. So that's what we mean when we say have clean recyclables. Let's see a question.
Wait.
A lot of boxes have plastic bags inside. Should we take those plastic bags out, recycle the box, and keep the plastic? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think a cardboard box with plastic bags inside, like when you order from Amazon maybe or something. Oh, cereal, yeah. Yeah, so that is a type of plastic that you'll notice my bottles, tubs, jugs, and jars, those are all rigid plastics that can hold their shape. That plastic bag, like in a cereal box, is not recyclable. That one has to be landfilled. And I should mention when I was talking about landfills is they do serve a purpose. I'm not necessarily anti-landfill, but I think we can be smarter with them. So,
just throw the whole box.
yeah, throw the whole box in, and that's part of my job is to try to explain why keep that plastic bag out. And the way I see my work, I hope this can be my career for my whole life, and I hope that the different rules, the different types of materials consistently reduce confusion and reduce cost and reduce that convenience barrier so that, materials we don't even have to think twice. Yeah, this is recyclable, like an aluminum can is. I keep feeling this little mic just scooting away every time I talk. Let's see.
I'm going to give the folks that need to leave, it is time, but I would love to hear the rest of your presentation. But I do want to honor anybody that needs to leave.
Sure.
Go ahead.
And for whoever needs to leave, if you want to stay in touch with me, if you didn't write down your email address, have a moment to do that. Or if you want to ask me about something in specific, I have a rather small stack of business cards here, but I'll leave them with you.
Looks like everybody's still interested, so go for it.
So go to Pam if you need to leave early but want to stay in touch with me. Yeah, hi. Yes, Ridwell. So that's a newer service in the Denver area, and I'm a big fan. I know the manager here in Denver, and what Ridwell is a doorstop, hard-to-recycle collection service. So similar to a curbside recycling bin, they put a cute little box up at your doorstep, and they'll let you know that, hey, we will recycle your light bulbs and textiles and batteries, electronics. And one really cool thing that they beat me to it, I wanted to do this project and they're a little faster than I could be, was they'll do special collection events. So they'll say, hey, this week we're taking reusable bags. And what they did is they partnered with a local food bank called We Don't Waste in North Denver. So Ridwell let all their customers know we're taking reusable bags because if you're like me, you have more reusable bags in the back of your car than you need. But Ridwell made it convenient to collect all those reusable bags, partnered locally, and now those reusable bags can be filled up with food and given to people who are food insecure. So they've got their food and then also a reusable bag to use. So I'm a fan of Ridwell, and I hope they continue to grow and do well locally. Another question, yeah.
What else do they recycle? Do they do the hard to recycle, the bigger ones?
It's a smaller box, and you can find their full list of what they accept online because I think it might vary from city to city. So I don't want to speak too much on what else they recycle, but Do you have Ridwell? So ask her and she'll tell you all about what they take. Let's hit the next slide here. And I see that, I've already been talking for about an hour, but I again, really believe in answering those questions. And if I don't get to the whole presentation, that's okay. But oh, okay. If you could go back a few slides there, I listed out at least EcoCycle's hard to recycle materials. There it is. All right, and as I'm looking at this, it's not a great slide as it's zoomed out, but I'll talk through some of the different materials that we take at our drop-off center. So I mentioned electronics, and we recycle with Blue Star recyclers on site, so they disassemble and collect at our Center for Hard to Recycle Materials, or CHARM as the abbreviation. We take small appliances and work with other, if it's outside of an electronic, we also take blenders and fans and work with other disassemblers. We take those types of plastic films that you asked earlier about, and the reason we can take them is because we can sort them separately outside of that facility. And those plastic films, like a plastic bag or bubble wrap, we work with a company called Trex Decking, T-R-E-X, and they melt down these plastic films, and that takes a lot of them to do it, but they melt them down and make a composite decking material. So we're proud of that partnership too, because really the problem with single-use plastic bags is we use so many of them. So if we can find a way to recycle at least some of them, we're upcycling it in a sense and making a more durable material out of it. We also partner with a local bike company that does Frankenstein bikes, so they take all sorts of parts and stitch them together, and what a great thing to give someone a bike or have a specific part for them. We also take all sorts of scrap metal. We take books and try to sell the books too. If it's a valuable book, we work with a broker. But we also recycle books like our old PC manuals that really have no use anymore. Fire extinguishers, mattresses, porcelain toilets and sinks. That full list, if you do want to fill up your truck or work with your neighbors, that full list can be found online. And for most of these materials, it's a $3 facility fee. So just to come in, it takes $3 to keep the lights on. But for something like a mattress or an electronic that takes that labor, there's a fee on top of that. So all that can be found on our website at ecocycle.org. So if you want to hit the next, maybe it's 2 slides, the compost slide. And I see a question here. Shoes, now shoes are a tricky one because there's all sorts of materials and it's hard to pull out, for instance, just the leather and recycle that. So we take shoes and clothes that can be reworn, but we don't have a good way to actually recycle like a t-shirt or in a lot of cases shoes. So that's one of those materials when we're thinking, is there a way to rethink and redesign shoes and t-shirts, or is there technology that we need to get to properly recycle those materials? But fast fashion makes a tremendous environmental impact, so we need to come up with ways to be smarter with clothes. And I'll pause there because as you can tell, I like to go off on my tangent, and I'll tell you everything you need to know about a subject. But I do want to talk about composting because I think that this is a tremendous opportunity and way that we can take action, whether it's through a curbside composting system or composting in your backyard. So I mentioned the benefits of keeping organic material out of the landfill, but there's also a lot of benefits of composting that material. And really from Fort Collins to Colorado Springs, all of the curbside, what we call industrial composting, goes to A1 Organics in Keensburg. And they're a big 200-acre facility that they take in all sorts of food scraps and yard waste and make these giant 15-foot tall piles of materials that essentially works just like how your backyard compost might work. Gets hot, there's microbe activity in there, kind of cooks down, and they can blend it up. And after 2 months or so, you have a finished compost soil additive, right? Does anyone here garden? All right, we got some gardeners. And I believe that, in a lot of cases, a backyard garden benefits from a backyard compost pile, and on an industrial scale, Colorado's lands benefit from industrial composting. So when we have more of this compost, it can be added to rangelands or open space, and I'd like to walk through some of the benefits of adding compost to these soils. And on the climate side, when you add compost to soils, it helps strengthen plants and retain water. And when you have stronger plants, they pull more carbon out of the atmosphere. So that is a climate solution in one sense, but also on the agricultural side, when you add compost to soils, it helps to retain more water so that soil's more spongy compared to, in the case of Colorado, we have very dry, clayey soils, which is hard to plant in. And if you try to water something, a lot of times that water will just run right off the soil because it's not healthy and rich. And in that case, it might carry along that you might have to water the soils more, or it can wash off any sort of chemical fertilizer that goes back into our water system. So by adding compost, it helps that soil become more alive and retain more water and grow more nutritious crops. So it's a win-win in that sense for composting. If you hit the next slide, please. You might have heard the news that A1 Organics used to accept all sorts of different types of organic materials. And I say organic loosely, meaning things that are made of other materials that used to be alive. So they would take paper products and paper towels that were recently trees and break down fairly easily, and they were also taking all sorts of compostable materials. Now, recently they changed the rules and it really pulled back the types of materials that they accept. And the reason was they were getting a lot of contamination in their compost materials. So they were getting glass and plastics that, you don't want in soils. They never fully integrate, they just break down into smaller pieces. And in the case of glass, that could be dangerous, right, if you're putting it on the ground. So they said, based on their studies and based on other compost facilities, they said, we really need to pull back what we're accepting, and to simplify things, we only want food scraps and yard materials. Not only does that cut down on contamination, but that's also the higher quality material. That's the material that they really want to make a healthy compost that will help Colorado's soils. Next slide, please. So I'll pause there. Any questions on composting?
I just want to say, make sure you take off those stickers that are not recyclable on fruits and
Thank
Make
you.
sure you take the stickers off, like an avocado, has a little, or banana or whatever, apple. Take the sticker off because it shouldn't go in your compost bin.
That's the number one problem that they see at A1 Organics is the little stickers from produce. So they're trying a big education campaign to prevent that and trying to implement some technologies to pull those plastics out. But the best way is to try to prevent it from getting into the compost in the first place. So I want to spend, I'll go through this policy fairly quickly and then start to wrap up my presentation. And again, I'm happy to hang out as long as Pam will allow me. But I want to talk a little bit about a groundbreaking law that was passed last year in the Colorado State Legislature, and that is called Producer Responsibility for Recycling. And you might have heard of this system be called Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR. And what this policy is, and that it will, I should say too, it'll take a few years to roll this policy out because there's a lot to set up. But essentially what the concept of producer responsibility is to take the responsibility of paying for recycling off the consumer, the subscriber to a recycling service, or in a lot of cases, the taxpayer, and we'll put that cost back on the producer. Now, the first thing that might be an alarm is saying, wait a minute, won't that raise prices of the products if companies are paying for recycling? And based on decades of experience with this policy in Canada and Europe that have much higher and more advanced recycling systems, the answer is not really, because we use so much packaging. If there's any sort of fee attached to cardboard or aluminum, we're talking in the thousandths of a percentage of a cent per packaging that really does add up and can pay for recycling statewide. So it'll take some time to set up this system, but it'll be run by the producers who are paying into this system. And as EcoCycle advocated for this policy, we worked alongside Coca-Cola, of all people. They said that we're a big beverage industry. We want more aluminum back to make our beverages. We want more recycled plastic to make our beverages with, and we want to support this policy that, I should mention, Coca-Cola is a global company. They already have experience with this sort of policy in Canada and across Europe and in other countries around the world that use this system. Should mention too that this isn't for all producers of packaging, but really the bigger ones, the biggest ones that make the most packaging material. Now, if you attach a small percentage of a fee on different types of materials, if we go back to that rethink and redesign, it makes sense to have a lower recycling fee or due for materials that are recyclable and valuable, such as aluminum and cardboard, compared to materials that are not recyclable and terrible for the environment, such as styrofoam. So it will take a few years to set up this system and get it running, but the idea is, through this system, it will cancel the cost for all of us to recycle and also expand recycling to all the corners of Colorado that can't have their own recycling systems. Again, as we advocated for this policy, and it was a big learning lesson for me, is that we brought in all sorts of partners on this, and in a lot of cases, it was rural communities that said, yes, we want recycling, we understand this policy and think it will work for our community. If you'll hit the next slide, please, I'll keep talking about this. And I won't talk through these different benefits. I think I've mentioned why I think that advancing circular systems and recycling is a good thing, not just for Colorado, but for the world. But if you hit the next slide, if you want to learn more about this policy in particular and read the different letters of support that EcoCycle and our partners got for this policy, we set up a campaign website that's still running, and that's at recyclingforallcoloradans.org. And we have all sorts of fact sheets and ways to explain this policy more in detail. Next slide, please. So I like to wrap up by talking about misconceptions or myth busting that I hope I've busted through my presentation. I think a consequence of being long-winded like I am is to confuse matters more, so I hope I didn't do that too much. But I hope that by talking about this, I broke the myth that recycling and zero waste is a low-impact system. It has a high impact, and it can be even higher the more we turn on to this idea and change the systems that surround zero waste. Now, it's not a perfect system, but I don't think it's a completely broken system. In fact, it's not a broken system. When the pandemic happened, recycling was one of those first essential workers or essential services. I forget the exact term, but the idea was we depend on the material that gets recycled to continue to be recycled locally. I also like to say something about perfectionism or green shaming that we see in all sorts of environmental issues, and say that perfectionism, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And I really like this quote that is mentioned by someone who goes by the name the Zero Waste Chef. She does zero waste cooking books and videos, and she says, "We don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly, we need millions of people doing it imperfectly." And I think that sort of idea applies to all sorts of environmental issues, and I dislike this idea of perfectionism or putting guilt on yourself or others, because all the social science says that trying to shame people into being more green or however you want them to be, it not only does not convince them, but it also makes them annoyed with you and want to turn in the other direction. So what I believe, instead of green shaming or perfectionism, is what I'm trying to do here tonight, and that's educate, meet people where they're at, answer questions if people have questions, and if you don't know a question, as I've mentioned through this presentation, I I know a lot about the subject, but I can't know everything, is I want to try to answer questions for you or get back to you on them. So that's my 2 cents that I like to add in here. Next slide, please. Now, my last 2 slides are on what you can do both on an individual level and on an organizational level. And one great place to start when you're thinking about zero waste is to look at your own household and think, where is waste generated? And in the most cases, it's in your kitchen and in your restroom. Excuse me. And if, in a lot of cases, right, waste is out of sight and out of mind. Excuse me. But if you take a more critical look at your recycling bin or in your trash bin, ask yourself, is there any material where it's like, I don't really know if this is recyclable or not? Or, wow, I sure do drink a lot of sparkling soda. Maybe I should think about investing in one of those soda stream machines, something like that. That's a great place to start, is by looking at your own household and thinking about different ways to reduce waste. There are also zero waste stores across the Denver metro area, and they have all sorts of really cool, durable goods or forward-thinking materials on how to reduce waste in your household. So there's Zero Market in Edgewater Marketplace and in the Stanley Marketplace in Aurora. There's Off the Bottle Refill Shop right in Capitol Hill. And then, I forget the last one. Another refill shop in Highlands area. So if you're in that area and feel like shopping for a more durable thing like a nice razor, etc., check out a zero waste store. And as I mentioned, none of these sort of systems work without those relationships, right? We need that relationship with Blue Star Recyclers or Springback to keep recycling these materials, and that's the same case in our individual lives, right? Is that you can do your part or get involved by continuing to learn and educate others. And I really believe that in environmental issues, there's something for everyone, and whatever your skills are, you can apply that, and that will help the environmental issue, or even, you can apply it to social issues, economic issues. What I've learned in my 2 years at EcoCycle is that it takes, to get anything done, it takes a diverse array of perspectives and talents, and by working together, you can achieve your goals. If you want to hit the next slide, I'll talk about a little bit larger projects. One of the great projects that I like to do, and I'm doing one at the University of Denver at the end of April, is hosting a litter cleanup event. And that's a great way to meet up at a park and just sweep it up. And you don't need a group to pick up trash, but it's more fun to do that. So I think that hosting litter cleanup events it's an accessible way to get folks involved. What I found is that a lot of people want to do something for the environment, and they're not quite sure what to do. And by saying, hey, we're meeting at this park on this day at this time, wear comfortable shoes, you can clean up a park and you can immediately see all the litter that accumulates. It's not a cure for litter, but it's something. It's something that you can step back and say, by working with my community, I beautified this park or street or neighborhood. You can join or create an organization. Looks like you're all organized here with a delicious soup dinners. And again, on that clipboard, if you want to be tuned in with EcoCycle's work, we don't bombard you with emails, but we'll keep you up to date on zero waste happenings. And I already mentioned, I really believe in putting your strengths to work, whatever they might be. Next slide, please. Pam mentioned up front, we're a nonprofit. We invest all the money that we make back into employees and into our systems, buying new machinery like the electric truck, etc. So if you want to learn more about our work, we do annual reports that talk about the different projects that we do. Just go to ecocycle.org, and we have a donate page, but we also have a ton of resources to dig through, and videos on all sorts of different subjects. Next slide, please. So I hope this evening I've showed that zero waste is more than just reduce, reuse, recycle. I hope I've sparked an interest in whatever it might be, whether it's compost or hard-to-recycle materials. And I also want to just thank you all for sitting around, listening to me, engaging with me, asking me good questions. It's not lost on me that, it's easier to stay home, but I'm always touched when people turn out and spend the time to listen to me. So thank you all.
Any last questions before we, Harry's got a question. Of course he does.
When it comes to aluminum recycling, is it necessary to crush your cans or not crush? Does it make a difference?
So that's a good question about whether cans should be crushed or not, and the answer is that they should not be crushed. And the reason is, when they are sorted at a recycling facility, they use something called an eddy current, which is a reverse magnet that, if you try to stick a magnet on an aluminum can, it won't stick. But this eddy current, and don't ask me the science of it, I don't know the science of it, but it creates an electrical current that pushes aluminum away. So as recycling goes across a conveyor belt, aluminum cans, and if they're whole, that current identifies it better, and it will kick that aluminum can to be separated.
Oh, prescription pill bottles are frustrating. And I have found someone will take them. Max Fund, which is for pets, I think, they will take them and use them for pills for animals. So, what?
That's great, and
Those
someone
empty?
mentioned
Yes,
that...
empty, sorry.
Empty.
Empty pill bottles, and you take the labels off, of course.
Let me double check my little guide here.
So the question was, are the pill bottles recyclable?
Yeah, let me, this guide's a little out of date, and this is something I should know, but let me double check here on plastics, because that is technically falls into that bottle, tub, jug, and jar. And let's see. Yes, they are recyclable.
Okay,
Glad I
good.
could answer that. That's one that I should know, so I'm going to keep that back here.
They can be reused though, by the
Yes. Yes, or recycled at pharmacies, as someone pointed out earlier, along with old pharmaceuticals.
What was the name of the mattress recycling?
Springback. Yeah.
Springback will do the mattresses as
Yeah.
well as the batteries and all.
So Springback will do just mattresses, and you can call them and set up a collection service. It's a little bit more, but if that's a project that this community wants to do, collect mattresses and have them come pick it up, that's a project. But the electronics recycling company is called Blue Star Recyclers.
Okay, I'm gonna stop for right now, and anybody that has more questions, please come up and ask Ryan, but I think we've got some people that need to head out. So, thank you.
Thanks, Pam.